Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this webinar by Arab Center, Washington, D.C., entitled Russia's War in Ukraine and its Impact on the Middle East. We, I guess, have all been witnessing the evolution of conflict in Ukraine for several years. But on February 24th, 2022, as all of you fully know, Russia launched a large-scale invasion of Ukraine that has resulted in a global crisis whose impact affected countries way beyond, actually, the borders of Europe. The globalization or internationalization of the conflict spread rather quickly, even by the second week of this conflict. And now when we look at it with more than 4.1 million Ukrainian refugees who have left or were forced to leave the country, an estimated 6.5 million Ukrainians internally displaced, together more than 10 million, one-fourth of the population, including almost one-half of the children of Ukraine, thus making it, if you will, the largest refugee crisis in Europe since World War II. The growing death toll, the massive destruction whose extent remains to be determined. The Ukraine war has clearly generated a shift in international diplomacy and in global strategic alliances. The Middle East and North Africa were not immune to that impact. They have also been feeling the reverberations from the Russian war in Ukraine. On the final leg, for example, of his just concluded trip to the region, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken confirmed yesterday in Algiers that, and I'm quoting him, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is having a deadly impact on the Arab world. What is the nature of that deadly impact, and how is it really affecting daily life in the Arab world? So the Arab Center, Washington, D.C., has organized this online seminar to discuss this question, to discuss the current and long-term impacts of this war on the Arab world, including significant effects on vital food supplies, considering the dependence of many countries in the region on a very large percentage of their food, particularly grain, wheat, and so on, from that region. So in addition to food supplies, oil and wheat prices, global energy routes, conflicts in Libya and Syria being impacted, the refugee crisis, the situation in Palestine and Israel, particularly with the implications for Palestine of this conflict, and the role Israel is trying to play to manipulate, if you will, this conflict to its own advantage. In addition, of course, to the what I refer to as the shifting global alliances, not only in Western Europe, but also in regions like the Arab region. So to answer all these questions and to deal with the short-term and long-term implications of this crisis, we have invited to help us decipher all these issues four great experts on the region with diverse expertise in different aspects of the crisis. We're delighted that they have taken time out of their busy schedule, teaching and writing and otherwise, to be with us today. I will introduce all four of them. Each one will have 10 to 12 minutes to make a key presentation. And then we will dedicate the last half hour of the meeting today, or the webinar today, for the art of conversation, Q&A session. And your questions are welcome. Feel free throughout the presentations to send your questions via the Zoom platform on your Zoom page. Or if you would like to, just email your questions to events@arabcenterdc.org. Again, events@arabcenterdc.org, and staff will include your question in the Zoom platform so we can read it. I will convey your questions to the speakers and hopefully try to cover as many of those as possible. I will introduce our speakers in the order they will be speaking. We will start with our good friend, Basma Momani, who is a professor of political science at the University of Waterloo with special expertise in the economy of the region. And she will be focusing on economic impact on Middle East and North Africa, food, commodity supplies and prices, oil and energy issues, and so on. She will be followed by Christian Potts Ulrichsen, Baker Institute Fellow for the Middle East at Rice University, and also a non-resident senior fellow here at Arab Center, Washington, DC. Third will be Hiba Gouaid, who is the Moormans Simon Assistant Professor of Sociology at Boston University. And she will be using her expertise and recent writings on the issue of refugees to kind of put in perspective what I refer to as the largest refugee crisis in Europe's recent history since WW2. And last but not least, our good friend and colleague, Yusuf Munayyer, who's a non-resident senior fellow at Arab Center, Washington, DC, who deals with the Israel-Palestine portfolio for us at the center. And he will be talking exactly about the impact on the Palestinians and on Israel and the role that Israel is trying to play as a mediator in this conflict and the implications of that. So as I said, we'll begin in that order. So let me invite at this point, Basma Momani, to begin her presentation, and you have 10 to 12 minutes, please.
Thank you, Khalil, and thank you to the Arab Center for the invitation. I get the opportunity to talk about the most boring part of this, which is the economic side of this. So I envy both Hiba and Yusuf and others for the interventions, but very happy to talk about the geopolitical aspect as well. So, I mean, I think, Khalil highlighted the key things that are going to be of interest to the region politically or economically, and really it's about mostly food and energy. Now, of course, food, let me focus on that because I think that's where we're going to see the great fallout politically. I don't need to remind people that the Arab Spring really, in many ways, was about food insecurity as well, both in terms of production yield decreases that, farmers felt very much. And so we saw the rural uprising in parts of Syria, for example, very much reacting to the downfall, or at least the decline. And with that, the sort of containing of prices. And so a lot of farmers really were suffering in Syria. Similarly, I think food uprisings and the cost of food, which really still at the end of the day, when you look at the fact that countries like Egypt continue to have such high rates of both poverty and certainly food insecurity, to take away their most important staple of nutrition is really, I think, catastrophic. So we're really just on the precipice of seeing what I think is enormous food insecurity throughout the region. Let me just break it down a little bit in terms of the numbers. We've all heard about how both Ukraine and Russia are indeed the world's largest exporters of wheat. In the case of, for example, Egypt, not only is it the largest consumer of Ukrainian wheat, but it really, we put both Russian and Ukrainian wheat together. It consumes about, or it comprises about 80% of all imports coming from Russia and Ukraine. And remember here, this is, not every country produces wheat. There are very limited, if you will, countries and climates that are applicable to do that. It's very specialized for those who understand it. And so what this means is it's not going to be something we can pivot. In fact, even more problematic is that, of course, we may be aware of this today, but we're looking at a lost season of growing already to begin the harvest of wheat. And so there's no makeup for it. There's no sort of alternative supply. It really is a decrease, quite literally, or removal of that. And so the challenge that, and I'm going to focus on Egypt for a second here, continue, is that, of course, as the largest just entire importer of wheat, that is going to be enormously damaging. And again, for most Egyptians, because of the subsidization of bread, which of course has continued to be eaten away at by successive regimes, it's been a thorny issue. I did my dissertation on Egypt and actually Egypt and the IMF. And the opening line of my dissertation was about the riots of 1978 and 9 related to the rise of wheat prices. So this is, something that continues to happen. For those who know the region well, 1988 was another sort of summer of uprisings across the region, from Tunisia, Algeria, Jordan, Egypt, Lebanon, all related to the price of wheat and the Arab Spring again, as I said. So this is something that's going to happen. It's going to come. We have Ramadan coming up very soon for those who are observant. And I think that's another challenge that's going to be faced. The fact that we have, continue to have, and this is just perhaps a different conversation, but allow me just to say, the reality that so much of the poor in the region continue to depend on, from, I remember very clearly, bread and tea is a disaster to humanity today. I don't know how else to say that, seeing how much is spent on extravagant new cities and new bridges and new roads, and people are still depending on the most basic supplies. And as far as I've been studying the region and visited the region, that has continued to be the case. So the fact that people live on dipping stale bread in tea for their only nutritious supplement is really devastating and a real blight on us. The other country I think we need to look at is Lebanon. In fact, even though Egypt is more reliant on wheat, Lebanon is more scary, if you will, because Egypt does have some reserves and still has market power, if you will, to be able to put an order in for alternate, whether grains or cereals, even generally food, and people still expect to get paid. That's not the case with Lebanon. So what I mean by that is Lebanon, although it imports less and is less dependent, 80% of the wheat is actually imported. And it's not nearly as dependent for caloric input, but 35% of the population's caloric intake comes from bread and grain in Lebanon. And they don't have alternate suppliers to go to because no one is going to take an order from Lebanon today. It really is that, terrible, because you're not going to get paid. So if you're a supplier, you're going to think twice about, reverting to Lebanon. This is all just to say this is the kind of challenge that's being faced by two of the countries. Yemen and Libya, of course, two very important challenges there, with still being in a state of war. They also respectively import 22 and 43%. So Yemen 22%, Libya 43% of their total wheat consumption just from Ukraine alone. So again, this is the kind of situation we're facing. I think no one wants to claim they have crystal balls anymore because we failed so many times on the Middle East, but I hate to say it, I think food insecurity because of the decline of wheat is something that we need to really watch. And certainly I think, Ramadan might be a slight respite, because we know historically it doesn't necessarily get people out. It's hard to sort of go to a protest, but it's not impossible. We've seen protests in Iran, for example, during Ramadan post breaking the fast. So there could be, I think, but we need to watch this very, very carefully. The other thing, of course, on the economic side, and certainly back to just quickly on commodities, is fertilizer. So another thing that Ukraine is a great exporter of is fertilizer, potash in particular. And so that decline means that also other harvests are not going to have the fertilizer needed. And so you can see how integral both Ukraine and Russia are to these, to the agricultural export and import business. And the fact that we don't have these two countries online is going to be very, very devastating. Now, oil and energy, which is the other sort of commodity that the region has been both blessed and cursed with, is another issue. Certainly, we all know that Russia is a major producer of gas and oil. The fact that Europe is desperately trying to pivot away from Russian oil and gas as a way to punish Russia is actually, again, a blessing and a curse, because what this also means is that we're seeing, very sadly, and I'll let the geopolitical folks want to comment on this a bit more, but what we see, in fact, is the Americans and the Western governments really chasing after long-held dictators. And it's not just in the Middle East, but it even sadly includes trying to make peace with Venezuela, Maduro, and others. So it's a real international problem now that, oil, being finite as it is, has now really reached a crisis point where, there are going to be a lot of strange bedfellows being created as a result. Oil prices are at an all-time high. And that, of course, can mean that countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and others feel very much emboldened. And so, having them being more politically emboldened is not a good thing in the region. From past experience, it's a disaster for Yemen. It means more funding to the war effort there, certainly. But it also means obviously more money to prop up other dictators. And so what we saw today, in the past few days, I should say, is an enormous amount of money being thrown into Egypt to prop up that regime as a result of both Saudi Arabia and even Qatar, who has put money towards the Sisi regime to sort of shore up their government bonds. That really is, I think, something that we need to think about again in terms of ramification. In fact, one of the things that we're seeing Saudi Arabia do, it's not really quiet about this, is that they are kind of holding the world hostage, saying that, as the largest swing producer of oil in the world, we will consider increasing our oil output, but only if we get more help on the war in Yemen. And so this is, again, as we all know, sadly, Saudi Arabian role in the war in Yemen is a disaster for the Yemeni people, first and foremost. It means more sorties, more bombing from the skies, and more pain and suffering for the average Yemeni. And also, of course, it means just more difficulty for the Yemeni economy, which is really the source of disaster for a lot of food insecurity in Yemen in particular. Again, the other thing too, I would just point out that, a lot of folks are talking about replacing Russian gas with Middle Eastern gas, but I think that's really easier said than done. So, that's probably a separate conversation about how reliant Europe is on Russian gas, but it's not a switch that can be turned on very easily. And so that actually means more profits for Middle Eastern oil, but it also, I think, is worth pointing out that, the sort of focus on trying to get the Qataris more on tap to reroute gas exports to Europe is wishful thinking. It doesn't happen that easy. And there's everything from, and there's a lot of better oil experts out there than me, but the kinds of ports that can receive a certain type of ship that has this kind of gas is not customized. And there's very few of that, particularly in Europe. And hence the real pipeline challenge that continues to keep that Russian-Europe relationship bound so tight is because of how easier that is than, frankly, the current situation of trying to get Qatari oil and gas or Middle Eastern oil and gas to European shores. So there's lots to say on that politically. I might just stop there, Khalil, only because I suspect I would love to come back and add more on the geopolitical elements of what I've raised, but hopefully that gives some context to what we're going to talk about.
Good, you did with our appetite. I'm sure we're going to have to come back, and the audience will be asking a bit more information on some of these general trends that you have indicated. We will move now to the focus on political responses, particularly in the Gulf region, what Basma just alluded to. With regards to oil, energy issues, and who is benefiting from what and who's manipulating what in the Gulf. And no one is better to explain some of that stuff to us than Christian, Coach Ulrichsen. Christian, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for including me on the panel. Very timely discussion indeed. I would maybe begin by just saying that in terms of political responses, we've seen from all Gulf countries that they don't really want to be pulled into taking sides. Even countries like Qatar and Kuwait and Oman, which have been seen as perhaps less sympathetic to Russia than the other three countries in the Gulf. But I think this is seen as a conflict in Europe between European countries involving, of course, NATO and the US in terms of other entities that doesn't involve the Gulf. And to the extent that that's important, it's important in the sense that obviously for decades now, the Gulf states have been closely integrated into US-led political security defense networks and partnerships. And so the optics of the Saudi and Emirati leaderships apparently not being willing to speak with President Biden, but happy to pick up the phone to Vladimir Putin is, I think, in that respect, quite remarkable. I don't think it's something that will be forgotten quickly, at least, anytime soon. The fact that these partners in the Gulf, the US partners, are not only trying to follow a balancing act, straddle the fence, but that in many ways, in some cases, seem to be closer to what is by now, I think, pretty close to being a US adversary, Russia. I think politically it's been quite fascinating to see, especially for Saudis and UAE, how they've been drifting geopolitically further away from the US. At the same time, perhaps the Qataris are moving further towards the US. Of course, we saw in end of January that Emir Tamim went to Washington. He became the first Gulf leader to see Biden since he took office. And Qatar is now a major NATO ally. Now, even Qatar hasn't officially taken sides, although I think by a lot of the metrics, the Qataris are more open to the Ukrainian position, say for Saudis and Emiratis. So you are seeing differences play out also in some of the fault lines that we've seen in Gulf politics over the past few years as well. Qatar moving in one direction, Saudi Arabia, UAE moving in tandem in quite a different direction. Now, I don't think that will necessarily lead to any friction within the Gulf, among the Gulf states themselves, although it certainly perhaps reinforces the notion that, at least for now, and at least with the Biden administration, politically, the relationship is quite warmer, I think, with Qatar, perhaps with Kuwait and Oman, and perhaps cooler with the other three Gulf states. And so that might have reinforced some of the trends we've seen over the past year and a half. I think it's also been quite striking how individual countries, again, taken individual positions. And I think it has maybe reinforced the notion that the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, is, if not dead, it's certainly not the driving force in regional politics. There hasn't really been a GCC position or even a GCC statement on the issue, even though some of the second order effects of this crisis have been some of the things that Besma talked about, which is obviously a steep increase in oil and gas prices, which clearly is of direct relevance to the Gulf states. Perhaps also a degree of at least short-term relief for economies such as Bahrain and Oman, but also, of course, the increase in commodity and food prices, which will have an impact, again, less perhaps in the Gulf states among Gulf nationals who are more insulated against food price rises, or less near the margin of subsistence, but of course, a lot of the migrant workers in the Gulf could be affected. And for the Saudis and the UAE, who are so heavily involved in Yemen, the impact on Yemen could be a further worsening of many of the humanitarian challenges that Yemen has faced. And of course, the Saudis and Emiratis will have, or will continue to bear some responsibility for events in Yemen going forward, even if and when, and we hope that at some point there's a political solution to end the fighting. So the GCC is certainly not insulated from the wider ramifications of this crisis, but we've yet really to see a common Gulf response. And I think it just reinforces the fact that on this, as in so many other issues, there really isn't a Gulf-wide consensus in any shape or form. I think the longer the war goes on, if we see these peace initiatives in Turkey not getting anywhere substantial, or if the war continues for any length of time, I do think it will be more difficult for partners in the Gulf to try and have it both ways, especially openly and visibly, as we've seen with maybe the Saudis and the UAE more so than some of the others. I think in a much more polarized international context, it will be more difficult, I think, to sort of have sort of play both sides effectively. I think if the war continues for any length of time, that balancing act will become much more challenging. And then it might be that they will be faced with a choice. And Mohammed bin Salman and Mohammed bin Zayed, perhaps that choice is quite difficult, because do you go with the authoritarian strongman, as in Vladimir Putin, or do you go with a political, economic, or political security and defense relationship of much longer standing, of much greater depth, but which has had some pretty significant strains in recent years? And we've seen, even in this crisis, how the UAE, by virtue of its position on the UN Security Council, is being forced to take positions very publicly that perhaps they wouldn't necessarily want to have to be forced to take. And certainly the UAE abstention on the two Security Council votes at the end of February on condemning the invasion and on calling the emergency session of the UN General Assembly, they caused a lot of anger, a lot of pushback in Washington. And not just for the sake of the abstention, but also for the optics of perhaps the UAE trying to trade that vote for Russian support for a very hardline position towards the Houthis in Yemen that US diplomats at the UN tried to and had to spend significant time watering down before the resolution was put to a vote. So I think the UAE, by virtue of its seat this year and next year, so for the foreseeable future, at least for this crisis, the UAE will be perhaps more exposed than some of the other Gulf states. I think maybe there will be implications longer term in terms of US policy, at least for this administration. This has clearly become a defining feature of at least this year, the second year of the Biden administration. One might argue that the way the Biden administration has handled the crisis so far, through close consultation with allies and partners, should have reassured Gulf partners who were so alarmed last summer by the manner of the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which was not conducted with any real coordination with partners and allies, and which, in the view of many in the Gulf, seemed to abandon a local partner to the Taliban. And of course, there were a lot of people, I think, in the Gulf who looked at that and thought, if they do that to the government in Afghanistan they spent 20 years supporting, could they do that to us? Will they leave us in the lurch at some point? And I think that the way the withdrawal from Afghanistan was handled only reinforced a lot of the skepticism about US credibility and staying power that had gradually built up under the Obama administration, continuing under the Trump administration, and now the Biden administration. So what we've seen has been interesting is that even though the Biden White House has to some extent restored a lot of that credibility, although he hasn't actually gotten a public opinion poll bounce in any way, he doesn't seem to have gotten a bounce in the Gulf either, at least in the Saudis and Emiratis, who continue, I think, to express frustration, skepticism, and anger at US policy. So I think these are deeper issues that are indicative, I think, of a direction of travel where no matter what the Biden administration does, it's going to cause a degree of friction in Riyadh and in Abu Dhabi. And that might be reflected, of course, in the fact that it's the Biden administration, which is seen to be in office at least for the next 2.5 years. Well, it's too early to begin to speculate about what might happen next. But certainly politically, it's putting further strain on US relations with some of the Gulf states, not with all of the Gulf states. Of course, Kuwait and Oman are trying to, and probably very successfully trying to remain out of this. But certainly I think that some of the divisions, or at least the different positions and lack of consensus within Gulf politics that we've seen so strongly over the past 5 years have been reinforced. And perhaps that rapprochement in regional politics, that sort of thawing of relations between Qatar and its neighbors after the Al-Ula declaration, between the UAE and Turkey, between, to some extent, Saudi Arabia and Turkey, and of course with Iran as well, that may now be not at risk, but certainly superseded by the greater international polarization. And if, of course, one of the byproducts or casualties of this greater international polarization is the Iran nuclear deal, for whatever reason, if that either gets across the line or doesn't, that will also have impacts on Gulf relations, because I think we have pretty clearly 3 Gulf countries in favor of re-engaging in the JCPOA, and 3 Gulf countries which are, again, much more ambivalent. So I think there too, we will see potential for additional fault lines, which could undermine that post-2019 spirit of rapprochement that had begun to define politics in the Gulf. I just think in this much more polarized international setting, that balancing act, which includes relations with China as well as with Russia, could become more difficult. Although if you're sitting in Riyadh or sitting in Abu Dhabi, you might think that the Chinese relationship is one for the 21st century, the US relationship is one from the past. Of course, if that begins to be the case, that could lead to some pretty hard questions on both sides of that relationship that can't be put off indefinitely. So it could be that this crisis has now speeded up some of the trajectories that were going to happen anyway, which may now come to a head. And so I think for those reasons alone, but also for others, like the impact on Yemen, the impact on food and energy prices, the fact that higher energy prices could begin to put off again some of the economic urgency of diversifying Gulf economies, I think they all bear closely watching as we move forward with this crisis, as we begin to move into maybe a medium-term frame, not just the first month. So yeah, with that, I'll pass back to you, Khalil, and look forward to any questions.
Thank you, Christian. You've raised some excellent points that definitely we will try to pursue a bit more during the Q&A session. Now we move to another important component of this webinar, which is basically the refugees, the displacements, the magnitude that I referred to during my introductory remarks. And to help us understand that and the impact of that and the connection, if you will, with the Arab world is Hiba Guwaid from Boston University. Hiba, you got 12 minutes. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Khalil, and thank you all for having me. I mean, least of all, I'm learning so much just being here today. So I'm really, really grateful to be here. So today I've been asked to speak about sort of putting the Ukrainian displacement crisis in conflict. And I want to begin by saying that the displacement of Ukrainians, like any other human crisis of displacement, is a terrible tragedy, right? We know the quantitative number. We know it's 4.1 million. But under that 4.1 million is a horrific human toll of war. It means that even people who do end up returning to their countries or who find legal status elsewhere are going to be condemned to mourn family members who are not going to return. And as we see with Syrians, Afghanis, Palestinians, Iraqis, war and persecution condemn families to endless diasporas, to be haunted even in joyful moments by guilt for loved ones who have suffered or who continue to suffer. And we know that the longer a war continues, the more people are going to be forced out of their home and into a global patchwork of national systems that are not designed to protect the displaced, right? Borders whose function is to exclude people who need resources and stability from countries that have it. The thing is, though, that while everyone subject to persecution suffers these dire, unfathomable human costs, the systems that they attempt to find respite in are not going to treat them all the same. And here, surprising no one who is paying attention, race matters. It matters in shaping who is seen as a human being seeking refuge and who is lumped into a refugee crisis, a horde, a wave, or a scourge. It determines whose lives are valued, who is recognized as someone who is worthy of state support and of refuge, and who is deemed to not be worthy of that same support. And the fact is that since it is, in this case, white, predominantly Christian refugees who are fleeing Ukraine, the world is paying more attention right now to issues of displacement. And some of that attention, rightfully, is focusing on racism that happens at the border too, right? Many, myself included, are calling out the ostentatious racism of discrepant treatment at the border we're witnessing between Ukrainians and people who are Black and brown refugees from other places in the world. We're witnessing, for instance, how Title 42, which is a public health ordinance introduced originally in the 1940s in the United States, it has been invoked, reducing people who are seeking refuge to the prospect of contagion at the US southern border, while the Biden administration has instructed Customs and Border Patrol to use their discretion when it comes to Ukrainians, but still not for anyone else. We know that Poland is building a 350 million euro wall to keep refugees out, while at the same time welcoming Ukrainian refugees in. We know that there are reports of people fleeing Ukraine where people are lined up, one line for white people, one line for non-white people. But what I'm going to argue today is that this focus on the more loud and ostentatious racism, right, what we see happening at borders, distracts from the more quiet, pernicious, logistical, systemic racism that's been going on well before the crisis began in Ukraine and will continue to go on long after it's over. The fact is that our systems of refuge are structured to dehumanize people, and as it turns out, particularly people from the Middle East, who comprise a disproportionate number of the world's refugees. And to understand this is to understand two things. So first is to understand that the epicenter of the world's displacement crisis today is the Middle East, right? With Syria being still the largest contributing country, and Turkey and countries like Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon, who have their own infrastructural challenges, as we heard, for instance, from Besma regarding Lebanon specifically, to overcome, are receiving the vast majority of these refugees. So as many of you already know, the number of displaced people globally right now far exceeds the proportions of displacement that followed World War II. Like, this is literally the worst it's ever been, and the situation is just getting more and more dire. So, you know, the UNHCR projects that due to the climate crisis, we're going to see about 20 million people displaced a year. And so today, over 84 million people, or 1 in every 95 people, is displaced, and these numbers have not been updated for Ukraine. Approximately half are displaced in their country of origin. So for Syria, there's about 5 out of the 11 million displaced Syrian people remain in Syria. And the remainder, the 6 million people, the vast majority of them, about 83%, remain in proximate countries, right? And we know that countries in the global south, countries that are proximate to conflict zones, are the ones doing the majority of the world's labor when it comes to confronting humanitarian crises of displacement. So for instance, Lebanon, a country with just 6 million people, hosts 1 million Syrian refugees. So what does this end up looking like on the ground? Again, let's put a human face to this. It looks like crowded camps at the border, for instance, in places like Gaziantep in Turkey. It looks like students with interrupted formal education. So only 34% of refugee students, refugee children are enrolled globally in schools, and it's about only 25% of Syrian refugees in Jordan, according to a recent study, were enrolled in schools. But part of the reason that these numbers are so low, right? Part of the reason that kids aren't getting, the resources they need, that we're not seeing, the support in these countries of immediate displacement, is that there's very little assistance offered to these countries in handling the challenges of supporting displaced people globally, right? They're getting very little help. And this brings me to my second point, which is that the world has effectively shut its coffers and its doors to supporting the region and displaced people from the region. So students of history, and I'm sure everybody on here knows, that the Middle East is a place that was ravaged by colonialism, right? Even the term Middle East has come under criticism for those same colonial roots. And you cannot understand the war in Syria, for instance, without understanding French colonialism. You also cannot understand it without understanding American imperialism and the fact that ISIS was born, for instance, in Kambuka, a US-run prison in Iraq. And again, you can't understand it without understanding the climate crisis, which is mostly driven by the developed world, right? By these high wealthy countries that are impacting our environment in ways that are most felt in these places that were former colonies. So what ends up happening is that refugees are knocking on the doors of the very same countries whose foreign policies have subjugated either them or people like them, and whose domestic policies too are patterned by the same racisms that facilitated those foreign policies. And in the name of state sovereignty, as I said before, countries have made their borders effectively impermeable to people leaving the Middle East. So this is true here in the United States. Recently, the Biden administration, for instance, has committed to welcoming 100,000 Ukrainians through a mix of humanitarian parole and resettlement. Simultaneously, the Biden administration neglects to build what is a decimated resettlement system. So though our yearly quota for resettlement this year is 125,000 people, the number of people actually that are being admitted is like in the tens of thousands, like I think at 20,000 the last time I checked. And that's because the Trump administration destroyed the resettlement program using Islamophobic rhetoric and specifically anti-Syrian rhetoric, but the Biden administration has neglected to rebuild it, right? We're spending billions on border security. There's definitely the money, but we're not rebuilding this program. And this leaves millions of people in the lurch in the conditions that I just described before, right? In these crowded camps without an education. But this is also true for Europe. I spent the last semester in Greece where I saw this for myself. So while, of course, in 2015, 1 million people took boats across the Aegean, and due to the sheer multitude, were able to make it to countries in Europe. And we can get into the wonky, like how they actually got there with the suspension of the Dublin regulation that's now back in full effect. Since then, the countries have closed their doors to new arrivals, right? And the Dublin regulation is very much in full effect, which looks like, people being sort of pushed to the periphery of the European Union. So today, anyone attempting a journey to Greece, for instance, from Izmir on a blow-up raft or through the land border in Evros, experience incredible amounts of violence. This violence is termed pushbacks, where authorities enter the water, Greek authorities, with the help of Frontex often, break people's engines, and against international law regulations, pull them back into Turkish waters. People are often brutally beaten in this process. And this policing, importantly, is married to physical walls, right? Incredible expenditure on walls from the European Union, but also, and more importantly, digital surveillance that's being also invested in these regions to keep people out. So for instance, one man I spoke to described how refugees, and he was Syrian, described how refugees circumvent this. He and others told me that they leave smugglers' fees in a broker's office, who holds it on their behalf, because the pushbacks have gotten so frequent and so commonplace that migrants do not want to pay smugglers before making sure that they can actually get to where they're going. At the broker's place too, there's a DHL office, and they leave things like their passports, cherished photos, but also cell phones, fearful that they can be tracked by the signal on their phone. He described sewing phone numbers he needed upon arrival in the lapel of his t-shirt, saying they have all this technology, but we have this, pulling on his shirt tag. I did the interview with the man in an ISO box, which is a converted shipping container in the camp he'd been living in Greece for 2 years. Camps, by the way, where children also don't go to school. And these are EU-funded camps, and they're called closed control access centers. And they are effectively prison-like conditions where refugees can only go out a couple of days a week, only with prior approval. And they cannot go out on Sundays because Greeks, as I was told, quote, deserve a day for themselves. And in these camps, you'll find people from all over the world. You'll find Syrians, Iraqis, Palestinians, Sudanese, Eritreans, Afghanis, and others. And they remain there as I speak to you today, right? And they remain there in a Europe that has bestowed automatic residency on 4 million Ukrainians who fled their country, right? And they remain, the people that I described to you remain sort of denied that opportunity for legal status, denied the warmth of welcome extended to Ukrainians, denied the chance to sort of be recognized fundamentally as human. And indeed, even when they do make it, right, even when people do arrive to the United States or to Canada or to Germany, which were the 3 countries I wrote about in my book, they still have to contend with systems that see them as outsiders. So here, for instance, Syrians who resettled had to deal with inflammatory rhetoric, again, of Trump and travel bans. They're subject to welfare policies in this country that barely support them when they arrive and expect them to be self-sufficient or non-reliant on government assistance shortly after their arrival. In Germany, they enter a system that is designed as a German system for Germans. Their credentials aren't recognized and their aspirations aren't recognized. And systematically, even when they're offered legal protection as a result, refugees from the Middle East and elsewhere in the world are not made to feel welcome. Their potential as human beings, their skills and abilities, their hopes and aspirations for themselves and for their children often go unheard. So to me, the reaction to Ukrainian refugees shows what's possible when we believe that people fleeing are centrally and primarily people, right? It invites us to imagine a world where we recognize people seeking refuge not as security threats or burdens, but as complex human beings with untold potential, just like me and you. So to conclude, I was asked to speak on how the Ukrainian crisis might impact the Middle East when it comes to displacement. And sure, one could say that Ukrainians, due to their preferential treatment, are getting services that could otherwise be allocated to people who are displaced, who have been waiting much longer, many of them from the region. However, I think this would miss a crucial point, which is that the rejection and denial of refugees from the Middle East that we're seeing and the burden that countries in the region carry was never about capacity of other countries to help or the capacity of other countries to admit people, but instead it was always due to a lack of political will to support people fleeing from the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Hiba. And now we will move to the least controversial aspect of this webinar, the impact on Israel and Palestine. And Yusuf, the microphone is yours. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Khalil, and thank you to all those on the panel who've contributed so much to this conversation already. I'm asked to sort of talk about the impact of this situation on Israel-Palestine, in particular look at Israel's role as a quote unquote mediator between Ukraine and Russia, and how we can sort of understand the different dynamics at play there. I think in sort of the big picture, when it comes to an impact on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, the biggest impact of this is that it is pushing the Israeli-Palestinian issue further down the international agenda. And that is, not saying much considering how much it has fallen off the top of the international agenda in recent years because of many other issues. But this, war between Russia and Ukraine has obviously dominated international bandwidth, particularly in the United States and in Europe. The situation in Israel-Palestine is further and further away from anyone's interest in dealing with. I think in the big picture, this is the biggest impact that it is going to have. At the same time, evolving dynamics on the ground in Palestine today might change that at any moment. Of course, this is the volatile nature of an apartheid system. So this is something we have to continue to keep our eyes on. But right now, the world is focused on the situation in Ukraine. When it comes to sort of Israel's role in diplomacy, I guess, between the Ukrainians and the Russians, I think it's important to keep in mind Israel's various interests vis-a-vis Ukraine and Russia. One thing many people don't necessarily know is that there are over 1.3 million Russian speakers in Israel. Russian is a very significant language among the Israeli population. It's not necessarily an official language, but it is a language that you will see often in public space, and is one that is utilized, including by some government organs and spaces where there are more Russian speakers. Much of this population is a population that came to Israel after the fall of the Soviet Union, in a major influx of nearly 1 million people at the time. And so this is a population that came not that long ago, still has closer ties with Russia and the people there. And I think importantly is also exposed to Russian media and Russian narrative around global events. And that is something that is seeping into and partly shaping the debate and discussion inside of Israel about their approach to the war between Russia and Ukraine. The Israelis, of course, have a relationship with Ukraine as well, and it has been a good diplomatic relationship in recent years. There's also, of course, a history, a difficult history for the Jewish people in Ukraine. The same can be said, of course, with Russia and other parts of Europe. But I think there's also a significant discomfort with the idea of Ukrainian nationalism that is sort of, something that haunts as a specter in the history. There is, at the same time, a Jewish population in Ukraine, which Israel sees that it has a responsibility to. So all of these things sort of factor into its relationships with both countries at this time, and is something that its government is trying to navigate carefully. One of the sort of most common heard explanations for Israel's hesitation to take a more Western aligned response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine is this notion that Israel actually has Russia on its border. This is something we've heard frequently, and of course, Russia and Israel do not actually share a border, but this is a reference to the Russian presence in Syria, with whom Israel does, of course, share a border, an armistice line. This is where Israeli interests come most directly into play. I have to say, for those countries that actually do share borders with Russia, and Russia shares borders with more countries than any other country in the world, including most of those neighbors being in Europe. It must be difficult to hear that the reason that the Israelis are not taking a harder line on Russia is because Russia is on their border, especially if you are Ukrainian and Russian troops are pouring over your border. But nonetheless, Syria is, and the Russian presence in Syria is one of the main sort of security interests that the Israelis are viewing this situation through. In Syria, of course, the Israelis and the Russians have something of an understanding around Israeli military strikes in Syria. And the Russians have regularly turned to look the other way as the Israelis have carried out strikes inside of Syria. The Israelis, of course, see this as part of their security interests vis-a-vis Iran and its reach inside Syria and beyond. The Russians have turned the other way in part because they too have an interest in sort of limiting Iran's role in Syria as well. So there's sort of been a modus vivendi here between the Russians and the Israelis in Syria, and there's something of a perhaps emerging agreement here, unspoken of course, that so long as Russia turns a blind eye to Israel's violations of Syrian sovereignty, Israel must be expected to do the same when it comes to Russia's violations of Ukrainian sovereignty. And so I think this is probably the biggest factor that is shaping Israel's policy towards this issue. One of the things that complicates this and adds to it is the fact that the Iran deal is being negotiated, and Russia has a seat at the table in a negotiation which, of course, the Israelis view as very important to their interests. The Israelis have made no bones about what they think about the Iran deal. They obviously do not want to see it move forward. The negotiations were advancing as it was reported to a very final stage in recent weeks. And it is, it certainly raises questions the way in which Israeli mediation around Ukraine and a visit by the Israeli Prime Minister, with the Russian Prime Minister was followed shortly thereafter by Russia throwing sort of a last-minute wrench into the Iranian deal negotiations. And one has to wonder if there was a sort of connection there. That certainly seems to have been the case. And it's not clear at this point when and if those negotiations are going to finally come to fruition in a new or return to the JCPOA. I'd also raise here the issue of Israeli domestic politics, which for those who have been following this issue, you know that in recent years, Israeli domestic politics has been through something of a unprecedented series of elections, which have failed until last year to produce a coalition government, which was the product of a rotational agreement between the current prime minister, who is Naftali Bennett, and the largest seat holder in the coalition, Yair Lapid, who is currently the foreign minister. And they are supposed to rotate halfway through the duration of the government's term. Of course, both of these individuals are seen a little bit differently by Washington, by the Biden administration in particular, and the sort of Israeli policy that we have heard from each of them has varied a little bit, with the foreign minister and the organs of the foreign ministry, whether it's the ambassadors or representatives at the United Nations or what have you, taking a more critical line against Russia, while the prime minister himself has constantly kept a door open to Moscow with his language. And so, I think that is something interesting to continue to watch here. The more Washington-facing head of what I like to call the two-headed monster of the Israeli government is, taking a line that is more welcomed by Washington, but the prime minister is taking one that is friendlier and relatively speaking to Moscow. I think this is going to have an impact on Israel's relationship with the United States, but the extent to which we will see. The United States has, of course, rallied a global response to the situation in Ukraine with its European allies. But as we've heard discussed here, Middle East allies, including Israel, have fallen sort of short, I think, of Washington's expectations. And this, is particularly striking for Israel, which tries to stand out in the Middle East as part of the sort of Western family. And here, I think Israel would want to distinguish itself from other countries in the Middle East as sort of a longstanding loyal partner of the United States that is not just a strategic ally, but also one with which there are quote unquote shared values. And yet, in a moment where there is a huge test of those values as they are described by Washington, Israel is not lining up along with Washington as one would have expected. And so, I think this does have a lasting effect. We will see how much, but the real reason for that is because, one of the things that shape long-term relationships is the way that nations see where their friends, their allies were in moments of need. And I think, as Christian mentioned earlier, with the recent visit by the Qatar Emir to the United States, the designation as a non-NATO ally, a lot of that was a product of the United States recognizing where Doha was in their moment of need during the crisis in Afghanistan. And so, where you line up in moments of crisis is something that I think is going to be remembered for some time. And, for countries that have long been, recipients of U.S. weapons and arms in the hundreds of billions of dollars, the American allies in the Middle East right now are not lining up the way that I think Washington would have liked to have seen. In terms of impact on the Palestinians, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I think in the big picture is going to be minimal. Of course, Palestinians have much bigger immediate concerns when it comes to the Israeli policies of occupation and apartheid that far more shape their life. But in the short and medium term, this is going to affect Palestinians as it does others in the region economically, with prices going up. And there is certainly concern about that within Palestinian markets. And there is also concern that the situation will provide cover for further Israeli violations in Palestinian territory as the world is distracted with this crisis. Latest polling among Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza shows that a large majority of the Palestinian public wants the Palestinian Authority to sort of take a neutral stand between Russia and Ukraine, which is not necessarily surprising, but a slightly larger number of the public blames Russia for starting the war. I think I will just close by saying a word about sort of the global response and what that says about what the international community can and is willing to do. I think the international response has showed that global pressure, particularly when it comes to targeted sanctions, is a usable tool to alter behavior. And we're seeing that being used significantly when it comes to targeting not just the Russian government, but the Russian economy and people in and around the Russian government as well, to try to alter Russian behavior. But this moment, I think, has also underscored the importance of international norms and why it is critical to uphold international norms at all times. And I think that anyone who has observed the Israeli-Palestinian issue knows that, when it comes to Western policy, we've routinely allowed international norms around the acquisition of territory and human rights be sort of left by the wayside. And I think it's clear that if norms are going to be, in fact, norms, if they are going to be upheld, they need to be upheld in all circumstances. And certainly the same can be said for international institutions. We've heard President Biden most recently speak about the Russian president as a war criminal. We've heard governments in Europe and elsewhere calling for, including the Ukrainian government, of course, calling for a ICC investigation when it comes to war crimes and so on. These are, of course, important institutions which should be allowed to pursue justice when it comes to violations of international law and war crimes. But often, of course, in the case of Israel and Palestine, they have been prevented from doing so by some of the very actors who are calling for them to be most active today. So I think the global response here really showed a great degree of hypocrisy that needs to be reevaluated if we are looking towards building a world where these kinds of things actually matter, and that we hope that they are held up over time. So I'll stop there and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Yusuf. Thank you to all four speakers for your excellent and provocative presentations. You've given us a lot of food for thought, and let's see what we got in terms of further questions from the audience. Let me start with Besma. There are several questions that relate to your presentation. One is kind of general, kind of on the macro level, and one on the micro level. The first one pertains to is the situation being exacerbated by the US inability to kind of maintain or stay as the sole leader or the sole only superpower in the world? It just doesn't seem to be adjusting to the realities on the ground, including the growth of Chinese, Russian, European rising power or rising influences. Is this, from your perspective, playing a role in making this crisis worse?
So that sounds like one of my international relations students' questions.
Yes.
So bear with me. I really dislike the framework of hegemonic stability theory, for those of you who know what that means. In fact, I was forced to think about that throughout my dissertation, which really, that was like 25, 30 years ago. So I don't know why I'm mentioning that, but it just reminds me of such an old debate of this idea that we need this one global superpower to keep peace. I mean, when has that ever happened? And I don't really see the Americans as the arbiter of keeping peace or stability or balance of power. I mean, it defies all logic. It's a very Western-centric view of the world to think that we need, even concept, it's very patronizing, right? This idea that we need this figure to sort of hold the peace together. They're the source of instability in many cases as well. That's not to say that this is not a challenge that we face today. At the end of the day, people are looking to the United States, and the Eastern European countries and Ukraine today are very much focused on looking for support from the United States. And I'm of two minds of this. Maybe perhaps it's my own kind of personal reckoning with seeing what happened with the Arab Spring, where I felt like it was a time for the Americans to put their money where their mouth was in terms of actually really doing the work of supporting people that are fighting for democracy. And so I certainly was one of those people that said, the Americans need to do more. Yes, but I'm also of the mind that this doesn't have to happen through military means. And so there's no desire here, I think, amongst the international community, and I use that very loosely, of course, to see the Americans, get into this war, if you will, even as terrible as Russia and Putin's regime is on the Ukrainian people, and even the Ukrainians themselves are saying, we just need more to defend ourselves. We don't want a single American foot soldier in this country, because they've got the resiliency and the drive to repel the Russians. They do need some defensive equipment, so I think there is some desire there for some military hardware, absolutely. But with that, we all need to be careful of those weapons do last after the war. Where are they going to be used? How are they going to be used? So there's a lot of responsibility there. But this is just a long-winded way of saying to the question, I'm not looking for, maybe this is a Canadian in me as well too, I'm not looking for the Americans to provide any sort of balance of power and bring back peace. But I would like to see, concerted effort to get some countries on board. I mean, Hungary is still very much in the back, supporting Russia throughout this. I think we are not helping by emboldening the power of a lot of these Arab dictators as well when it comes to countries like Saudi Arabia and others. So there's a lot that can be done, but it's more the political power and not the military power that I'd like to see come forward.
You did highlight in your presentation, Basma, the issue of the bread subsidies and the Arab Spring riots and relationship to bread and in a way needs, humanitarian needs in the Arab world. It seems to me that American diplomats are either panicking or they seem to kind of have noticed this issue a little bit better than in the past. Their warnings about things leading to potential food riots again in the region. Are they panicking, exaggerating, or is this kind of borne by the fact on the ground?
It's hard to tell, I mean, this is not the same Middle East that was at the time of the Arab Spring, partly because digital authoritarianism has gotten so much better throughout the region. So, the challenge with the Arab Spring, at least the first time around, was that, the mukhabarat were very sort of old-fashioned in the way they thought about crises. They just looked for presence on the street. And so they kind of ignored the digital world, which was amazing because it allowed so many, great minds to flourish and to thrive. Now, of course, they've picked up, thanks to a lot of Western technology, Israeli technology, a great deal of capacity in the digital realm. And so I don't think they're going to be taken by surprise in the same way. I say that, though, because I'm a firm believer, again, to throw some academics out there, the work of Asif Bayat and others who talk about, you got to look for protest in different ways. And it is happening in the Middle East, but it may not be in the same way that we're accustomed to. It might not be in the throes of people coming down to the street, but it might be in very different ways. And I think increasingly, it's hard, each country is very different. So, it wouldn't be fair to sort of kind of generalize, but I think that they're not being paranoid at all. Because of the enormity of the food insecurity that's before many of these countries, and the Middle East is getting far more expensive. Inequality is the gap between the rich and the poor, which I think was still a real determining factor of the Arab Spring, part one, is just gotten worse, and the space that was the outlet for being able to share ideas and get one's frustrations out have restricted. So, to me, that's a perfect storm of further upset. So I don't think they're paranoid, but I wish it was the Arab governments that were paranoid more so than the American government. And for that, they should wake up and start to realize, wait a minute, maybe we start investing in our people. Maybe this is, less guns and arms and more food and bread on people's table. So I really wish it was a wake up call for Arab governments and less so for the Americans, but I do believe it's warranted.
Thank you very much. Thank you to Azbek Balanian for the first question that Basma has addressed. I have a question from William Grant. Essentially, I'm going to direct it to Christian. It's addressed to Christian. Do MBS and MBZ not realize that they are betting on a losing horse? Do you really imagine that Russia could emerge unscathed from this crisis and maintain the same influence, particularly in the region, as before?
Well, I don't personally believe that Russia can ever well, at least Russia under Vladimir Putin can emerge unscathed. And I think the direction of travel so far has been that we see the Western sort of alliance in NATO being very different in terms of their reactions. It could be that MBS and MBZ see this issue as just another function of their very different world view from Washington, the fact that they themselves see themselves as authoritarian strongmen, with more in common, I think, with Vladimir Putin. I think that that has become more stark and perhaps more difficult to reconcile. And as I said, I think in my remarks, that balancing act between the different political, economic, security, defense, energy relationships, which until now I don't think has been seen as any form of a zero-sum game. I think that increasingly is becoming more difficult to keep going. And I think that's why the longer this goes on, the more polarized and deeper the chasm gets, that it will be more difficult. I don't know the extent to which MBS and MBZ themselves are looking long-term at this, or whether they're just taking initial responses based upon rapidly changing events. But certainly it's not a good look. And I think there'll be a lot of people in DC, for example, who will be looking at the behavior of partners in the Gulf and wondering exactly what it is that the partnerships are for, especially after the attacks on Abu Dhabi in January, the US response, which was significant, except that perhaps it wasn't as speedy or as decisive or as thorough as Saudis and Emiratis would have wanted. But then the question then becomes, well, will anything the Biden administration do be enough for MBS or MBZ at this moment in time? And so I think gaps have opened up, which might be difficult to bridge the wider they get.
Christian, I'm sure you did notice the pressure on these two countries with regards to, from the US, with regards to exiting OPEC Plus and their answer. No way, Jose. Do you think that's a rational demand from these countries at this time, regardless of the behavior of those two allies or so-called allies during this crisis?
Well, it's ironic in a way, just because last summer we had a big dispute between Saudi Arabia and the UAE over OPEC Plus and production quotas, for example, if you remember last summer, and also the meeting before that at the end of 2020. So the Saudis and Emiratis have hardly been on the same page, at least in terms of OPEC Plus. And of course, it's only 2 years ago, actually, since the beginning of the pandemic, the Saudis and the Russians engaged in a somewhat reckless attempt to outcompete each other, which sent the price of oil crashing to record lows, just as the pandemic began to, well, the pandemic sent demand plummeting too. So I don't think any of the parties are necessarily wedded ideologically to OPEC Plus or to the existing levels of production. They may be using those levels or their responses for more political points. I don't think that, and I think the fact that we've seen this issues and disputes over OPEC and between OPEC members in the past, I think they're using these for scoring political points. And clearly the sight of Joe Biden effectively asking for output to be raised because obviously gasoline prices are high and that hurts him politically. I think maybe in Riyadh or in Abu Dhabi, they see this as leverage they think they may have. Whether or not they do, they may see it as leverage they think they may have over Biden, over other issues, perhaps in Yemen, or the sight of Boris Johnson going off to Abu Dhabi and to Riyadh reinforces the notion that they would like to see that actually we are still the place that Western leaders come when they need our help. And of course, Boris Johnson was sent packing without really anything to show for his trip. In fact, the Saudis humiliated him by executing 3 people on the day of his visit, almost to say, well, we'll continue to do what we want, and no matter what you want us to do, we just won't do it. So sending a very powerful political statement and perhaps trying to use that as leverage, given that for now at least, they seem to think that they have it in their power, within their power to take actions that may affect oil and gasoline prices that obviously are causing political harm to governments around the world, but in this case also to the Biden administration.
Thank you, Christian. Hiba, you did highlight in your presentation the long-term damage and the European inconsistencies in dealing with the refugee issues before this crisis, during this crisis, and I think you alluded most probably that will continue after this crisis. Would you care to comment a little bit more about the long-term damage, particularly when you talk about the number you gave us, 24% of the children, refugee children, are without schooling. Well, what is the long-term damage of that? I mean, to future human rights situation, civil rights issues, and so on.
It's actually 75% don't have formal schooling. So I'm
Okay,
sorry if
I did reverse the numbers.
Yeah,
there,
it might be my misspeaking. Yeah, I mean, this is a huge regional crisis. And somebody in the comments actually balked at the fact that I mentioned colonialism or mentioned bordering, but you have to understand that this is all interconnected. And if you don't understand where the inequalities sort of emerge and how we're treating them, right, we're creating a regional crisis of unprecedented proportions. We're creating, 6 million people, who are in sort of legal limbo. And the longer that borders remain rigid against them, the longer that no assistance is offered them, you're having a whole generation of Arab kids who are just not getting an education. And that's devastating. People who are not getting chronic health, conditions taken care of. People who are, and when we don't resettle people in the United States, or we don't allow them in Europe, people die regularly in camp conditions. People die regularly in overcrowded situations. And so this is a huge issue with disastrous human consequences, and ones that are primarily being shouldered by countries in the region, which, as others on the panel have pointed out, have their own sort of infrastructural issues that they're navigating.
Another question directed to you, Hiba. I think you did answer it, but even though it's a bit critical, I would like to give you a chance to respond to it. And this is from Robert Charetta saying, I thought this event was focusing on the Ukraine war's impact on the Middle East. Why deal with or focus on French colonialism and Mexican-US border issues and American imperialism?
Yeah, Robert, unfortunately, has sort of a misunderstanding of, the world as an interconnected system. And that's exactly what I was addressing, right? In order to address the climate crisis, you have to address the inequality that produced it. In order to address displacement crises, you have to address borders, right? And you have to address the history that gave us those borders. You can't talk about one without the other. And certainly if you're addressing the impact of the Ukraine war on the region, you have to recognize that it's a region with huge amounts of, of war, violence, persecution that have resulted very much. And as Besma pointed out, right, the 1970s, this is protests to the IMF, the Egyptian bread riots, which is what they're called. It's protesting sort of austerity measures, right? And so when we think about this region, we think about displacement. When we think about the impact, we have to think about the human costs and the human experience of this impact. And I want to also clarify something, because I did also see another question about whether Ukrainians will continue to be welcomed in Europe. And the thing is that when we talk about just the differential treatment, what we're not recognizing is that people do become marginalized. So even when you are given legal status, you can also experience sort of marginalization even with that legal status, which is another point, is that even if you are resettled or do seek asylum, you can experience marginalization. We have seen this also with white refugees. So for instance, in the 1990s, Germany returned Croatians to Croatia after offering them asylum for a while. And so we also have to recognize that, the magnitude of this crisis and also political maneuvering, right? How people are going to talk about Ukrainians displaced, not right now, but in the coming 2 or 3 years, may very well shift and create a crisis, an issue for them as well, in terms of what the solutions are for them.
Yusuf, a question for you regarding from Ronald Mendel regarding the focus on the Palestinian issue that you referred to as somehow off the screen, if you will, at least partially in the midst of this crisis. What prospects do you think that the Amnesty International report and the UN Special Rapporteur's statement on Israel and apartheid as an apartheid state will have on moving up the question of Palestine on this agenda that you referred to?
I'm not sure in the short term that that's going to have much of an impact on sort of moving it up the agenda, but I do think it's going to have an impact on changing the way that the issue is discussed internationally. The reports that were mentioned, both the UN Special Rapporteur's report and the Amnesty International report, finding that Israel is practicing the crime of apartheid against the Palestinian people, are two recent declarations that follow also reports in recent years by Human Rights Watch and the Israel's best known human rights organization, B'Tselem, as well, who've come to similar conclusions. And I think these all represent a growing consensus in the international human rights community around the issue of apartheid being practiced, and also reflect sort of a shifting consensus around how we view the Israeli-Palestinian issue altogether, one that is moving away from a vision of partition, which has sort of dominated the conversation in the international space, since the days of Madrid and Oslo. And towards a conversation that looks at the territory and the populations, holistically and in an intertwined fashion. And I think that is going to have an impact on the way we talk about this issue over time, even if it doesn't elevate its importance in diplomatic circles in the short term.
Ziad Boubaker basically is concluding that Israel doesn't really care about Russia or Ukraine as much as trying to focus on relocation of Jewish refugees from both countries on basically in the Palestinian territories or occupied Palestinian territories. Do you agree with this assessment, Yusuf?
Well, I think it could certainly do both, and I think they're going to look to do both. They have interests vis-a-vis Russia and Ukraine, and the Russian invasion of Ukraine that they're going to pursue that are external. But there's also, of course, the issue of resettling or settling, Ukrainians into Israel and Palestine, and for anyone who's watched how that played out when it comes to the settling of those who came to Israel from the former Soviet Union in the 1990s. That this is, of course, a process that is incentivized and subsidized heavily by the government into what the Israelis call the periphery of the country, which regularly includes occupied Palestinian territory. And so one only has to look at, for example, the Israeli settlement of Ariel deep inside the West Bank to understand how much the influx of Soviet Union refugees into Israel had to do with its growth in the last 20 years or so. And of course, as I noted, this is a process that is aided and abetted by the government. There is currently, recently the Jerusalem Post reported about a plan, by the World Zionist Organization to manage the settlement of Ukrainian refugees coming into Israel, into areas, of course, that include occupied territory in the West Bank and also in the Golan Heights as well. So, this is definitely an issue of concern, one that we should keep our eyes on.
Yeah, and also one cannot forget, Yusuf, and I'm sure you agree with me, the recent announcement by Israel, particularly Mr. Bennett, about the building of 5 new cities in the Nakab region in response to recent events in the region. I mean, 5 cities is a major development for a small country like Israel. And where are these people going to come from other than situations like this one that we are discussing? Let me direct this question to Basma again. How will a return to the JCPOA and the reintroduction of Iranian oil into the energy market, how will that affect the relationship between Saudi Arabia, UAE on the one hand, and Russia?
Yeah, that's a great question. In fact, some have argued that the Russians are trying to sort of stall or delay JCPOA 2.0 for that reason, because they really want to keep the market constrained, i.e. the supply market of oil to be constrained. So, I mean, in many ways, getting the JCPOA signed sooner, which I'm very much in support of personally, I think would be great for the oil market in terms of having more supply on tap.
Christian, with the West, this is from Gifanzu, with the West cutting ties with Russia, and as they are seeking more oil and gas, especially from the Gulf, to replace it, do you think Russia will retaliate, would move to basically guard its own interests in the MENA region and further destabilizing the region?
No.
Go ahead. No, that's fine. Go ahead, and then we'll pass the rest of it to Christian. But go ahead if you want to give a quick comment on that.
Sure. Quickly, no, because the region is the largest importer of weapons, and Russia is a huge supplier of weapons. So it's not in their interest to, frankly, try to target or undermine Middle East governments. They want to stay on side so they can keep buying weapons from the Russians.
Thank you, Christian.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think also, I mean, Russia has its own interests in places like Syria, for example. It's got relationships with Khalifa Haftar in Libya. So it's already involved in certain ways with spoiler parties and also with parties that are not friendly to the West. And so, I mean, to some extent, it can continue to play a spoiler role, but it's already been playing that for a number of years anyway. And the question then becomes, does it become more proactive in trying to maybe play a spoiler role? But again, I would agree with Besma that in that respect, I don't see that happening.
Christian, you're in the region right now. Could you quickly summarize to us Arab public opinion in general regarding the Ukrainian-Russian war?
Well, I mean, there is a sense that this doesn't directly involve the Gulf countries or the region. I think there's also a sense that there is, as others have said, there is a degree of hypocrisy and double standards in terms of the refugee flows from the Middle East, some sort of much more critically examined than when they are Ukrainians fleeing Russia. I think that has awakened a degree of frustration among many people. And of course, the fact that for the last 7 years, Yemen has been subject to military intervention, and that this hasn't been anything like as big a regional or international issue as the war in Ukraine. So, I mean, I think it's exposed some of the, not the double standards per se, but they're just at least the very different ways in which regional issues are looked at if they're in the Middle East vis-a-vis whether they're in Europe. That's certainly been something that I've picked up on in conversations.
Thank you. Talking about double standards, Youssef, Dalia Hatuka would like for you to talk a little bit more about double standards of the global response to the Ukraine war in terms of the right to resistance versus in Ukraine versus in Palestine.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is, for anyone who's studied sort of the discourse on terrorism, knows that this is just the most recent example of when our friends do it, it's legitimate and it's fighting for freedom, but when it's being done to our friends, it's terrorism, and so on and so forth. It's quite remarkable, I have to say, the extent to which, particularly here in the United States and in the West more broadly, there is a real cheering on of the use of force against Russians in Ukraine by civilians. I've seen interviews with lawmakers who are taking up weapons, with grandmothers who are putting together Molotov cocktails to use to throw at Russian tanks and so on. And at the same time, we know that when those very tactics are directed at Israeli soldiers in occupied territory, or Israeli tanks or what have you. This is routinely described here as acts of terrorism. The people who are doing that are then targeted by the Israeli military, often killed in the process of doing so. And that is never seen here as a war crime or a violation of their rights in any way. So it's a complete inversion. And this is, this is what I was talking about in my presentation when I was talking about the importance of norms and the importance of laws. We can't expect laws and norms to be around when we want them to be around if we are not upholding them all the time. And unfortunately, when it comes to U.S. policy towards Israel and Palestine, we have helped trample on international norms, international laws, and human rights standards, which now we want to see respected and upheld in Ukraine. And frankly, it just doesn't work like that.
Thank you, Yusuf. Let's conclude with this question for Hiba regarding, again, refugees. It's from Keiko Sakai. Is there a phenomenon occurring that indicates that neglect of refugees in the Middle East by prioritizing international asylum for them, like in the case of Ukraine, is reducing trust of Middle East countries toward the West?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that the trust should have already been reduced for all the reasons that I say. I do think that it's pushing people to sort of see it, right? It's so flagrant, so ostentatious, the racism right now. And also, among people who are displaced, I hear this all the time. I've been seeing a lot of young Syrians specifically talk about, we had to flee these same Russian tanks, and we entered a world due to fleeing these same Russian tanks. And, our reception was very, very different. So I think it has pushed people to really recognize, what this double treatment looks like. I think in the West and I think elsewhere, I think also in the region, it's really forced people to confront what the actual topography of, seeking refuge and what the actual system of seeking refuge looks like if you emerge from the region and attempt to seek refuge in the West. So absolutely.
Thank you so much, Hiba. Thank you, Christian. Thank you, Basma. Thank you, Yusuf, for your excellent presentations and tackling of these questions. I apologize to our audience because, frankly, we have as many questions that we haven't been able to get to as much as we did. So it's been a very interesting webinar. And to the audience, again, I say thank you for joining us today. Look forward to having you again in future events at Arab Center, and special thanks to all the speakers for taking time out of their busy schedules to be with us today. Until our next event, I bid you peace. Thank you very much, and bye-bye.